As a department, we've made significant strides in advancing human trafficking as a priority. We've secured convictions and lengthy sentences against members of extensive transnational trafficking networks that have exploited dozens and in some cases hundreds of victims for compelled labor, services, and commercial sex. We've convicted both individuals and domestic gangs for sex trafficking crimes they carry out entirely within the United States borders by preying on vulnerable members of our communities, including children as young as 12 years old, runaway homeless youth, and individuals struggling with opioid addictions. In our next panel, we will explore law enforcement issues while investigating human trafficking. Please join me in welcoming our next group of panelists. This next panel will be moderated by G. Zach Terwilliger, who is the 62nd United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. As the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer in the Eastern District of Virginia, Terwilliger supervises the prosecution of all federal crimes and the litigation of all civil matters in which the United States has an interest. As U.S. Attorney, Terwilliger leads a staff of over 250 prosecutors, civil litigators, and support personnel located in Alexandria, Newport News, Norfolk, and Richmond. Prior to his appointment as U.S. Attorney on May 25, 2018, Terwilliger served as an Associate Deputy Attorney General and Chief of Staff in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. In that role, Terwilliger was a principal advisor to senior Department of Justice leadership in areas such as corporate compliance, federal, state, and local law enforcement cooperation, violent crime reduction, and other critical matters. Terwilliger began his career at the Eastern District of Virginia as an intern in 1999 and returned in 2005 to serve as a summer law clerk. In 2008, after serving as a law clerk for the Honorable K. Michael Moore and the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida, Terwilliger was appointed as a Special Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia through a partnership with the Virginia Attorney General's Office, where he was an integral member of the Alexandria Division's Project Safe Neighborhood Initiative that focused on removing the most violent criminals from the community. Terwilliger was hired as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in 2010 and assigned to the Major Crimes Unit, where he prosecuted numerous violent crime, fraud, organized crime, and human trafficking cases, and managed law enforcement task forces focusing on human trafficking and firearms. In addition to his prosecutorial duties, Terwilliger served as a counselor to former U.S. Attorney Neil H. McBride, providing advice on legal, ethical, and personnel issues, and served as a spokesperson for the Eastern District of Virginia. From September of 2015 to September of 2016, Terwilliger served as counsel to Senate Judiciary Chairman Chuck Grassley, where he focused on issues relating to criminal law, elder justice, human trafficking, and the Bill of Rights. Terwilliger earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Government and Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia and graduated with the highest honors from the William & Mary School of Law. Terwilliger has lived in the Eastern District of Virginia for over 25 years. Please join me in welcoming our law enforcement panel.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Now I can truly die a happy man. I get a bio that long read in the Great Hall, I can just skip the rest. So in all seriousness, thank you all for being here. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, in large part to Detective Billy Wolf, or former Detective Billy Wolf, who you've seen walking around here. I started working this violation as a prosecutor, just stumbled into it. I was a gang prosecutor, and the gang that I prosecuted started focusing on human trafficking, and I really backed into this, this very violation, and I can't wait to let the gentleman to my left do the majority of talking, and we're going to try to keep this high tempo. We're getting long into the afternoon, and so rather than have each of them sort of give speeches or give their pronouncements, we're going to engage in what I think will be a robust debate. There may not be complete agreement across the board about what we're talking about, and we're going to delve into what it means to prosecute and investigate this, this terrible violation. violation. So I'm going to give truncated bios, which makes me look like a total horse's you-know-what now that I've had this incredible introduction, but I want to get down to brass tacks. So Lieutenant Snyder, if you'd raise your hand. Lieutenant Grant Snyder of the Minneapolis Police Department has spent nearly 30 years focusing on investigations, advocacy, and research involving victims of sexual assault, child sexual abuse, commercial sexual exploitation, and most recently, those struggling with homelessness. He has worked both in public and private sectors to include law enforcement and various nonprofits. Currently, he's lieutenant of both the Homelessness and Vulnerable Populations Initiative and the Recruitment and Hiring Unit of the Minneapolis Police Department's Procedural Justice Unit. Detective Chad Opitz, next to him, is currently a detective with the Beaverton Police Department in Beaverton, Oregon. I see his U.S. Attorney, Billy Williams, here, and a task force officer on the Portland FBI Child Exploitation Task Force. He's a 20-year law enforcement officer and has been a detective for the last 14. Detective Opitz is also assigned as an investigator to the Washington County Major Crimes Team. He's worked sex trafficking-related crimes, since 2008, with a focus on protecting victims of child exploitation and targeting the pimps that exploit those minors. Supervisory Special Agent Leonard or Lenny Carullo. In April 2019, Leonard Carullo became the unit chief of the FBI Crimes Against Children and Human Trafficking Unit, which provides program management for child exploitation and human trafficking matters to all 56 FBI field offices, as well as to set strategic goals and objectives from a national perspective. Prior to this assignment, Leonard supervised the FBI New Orleans Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force for over 2 years. He became a FBI Special Agent in 2002 and has been assigned to the Houston and New Orleans field offices where he investigated these violations, amongst others. Supervisory Special Agent John Freeman is a Supervisory Special Agent with the Diplomatic Security Service, or DSS, with the U.S. Department of State. We just had the benefit of having the TIP ambassador here, and so the Department of State plays a major role in anti-trafficking, as you know. So working within DSS criminal investigations, John is the Human Trafficking Investigations Coordinator for DS field offices domestically, as well as DS offices in more than 270 embassies and consulates in 180 nations. Having worked some of these labor trafficking cases abroad personally, you just can't overestimate the value of having DSS support on these investigations. His previous assignments include postings to U.S. embassies in Nigeria and South Korea, the Department of State representative to the Joint Terrorism Task Force Seattle, and Secretary Condoleezza Rice's protection detail. And so one of the things that I want to do is just get right down to brass tacks. So our first question that I want to delve into, looking to our recent history, human trafficking, at least in, and I'll confine this maybe to the District, Maryland, Virginia, DMV area, but I hope it's true nationwide, went from something that was perceived to be happening in far-flung countries across the globe to something many, obviously all of you in this room, now realize is happening right under our noses. So my first question, and Detective Opitz, if you'd take it, how has increased awareness amongst the public, first responders, school personnel, affected our ability to detect and combat trafficking?
First, I'd like to say thank you. It's an honor to come and speak to you folks way on from the West Coast, so I appreciate that, and thank you, DOJ. And touching base on that question, the awareness overall has obviously been a huge impact for us as law enforcement and working in the trafficking related cases for a while now, especially getting it in the schools, having more NGOs pop up and willing to engage that fight with us. But what I want to kind of touch on is a lot of the NGOs obviously have it in their right heart, and they mean well. And I think what I want to make sure that we do on the law enforcement side is reach out to them and keep them involved through the investigative process and have MDTs that incorporate them so we use their information. I've seen a few times where an NGO or a group that is fighting trafficking, where they will keep and do as much as they can by themselves. They will go out and they'll do undercover dates and they'll try to locate minors and identify victims or survivors, and then obviously focus on the traffickers, and then they'll present us with this case and say, here, your turn, or you take it from here. And so that can complicate things quite a bit. One is a huge safety thing, just that's my opinion. And then it complicates the case not only for the criminal side of things, but also for making sure that survivor or victim gets the help the same way each time, because I think that's important to establish a repetitive process where we're making that contact and getting the help that they need, that's the appropriate help.
Lieutenant, can you continue with a local perspective?
Yeah, I'd like to. Thanks, Chad. That was a great discussion there. And thanks again, Chad, I appreciate being here. You know, increased awareness has done so much to open up our imagination about capacity. That's one of the things. It's also brought a number of other people that we wouldn't formally have considered necessarily as partners and effective partners into the work that we do. The dark side of awareness is that we create a passion. And when you create a passion without an on-ramp, you create issues like I think Chad was sort of alluding to. And so we really were so interested and got moving with so much trajectory about creating awareness and creating an impassioned group of professionals and nonprofit providers and a public that would understand and imagine this, that we really never imagined or thought about how are we going to incorporate that passion in an effective and measured way that wouldn't complicate and make our investigations more difficult and frankly challenge the recovery of our survivors.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's the only violation I've ever worked where I have found a mountain of resources, yet the one resource we really needed, which was bed space for individuals recovering from trafficking, didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So every church that I walked into, every synagogue, every Rotary Club was, what can we do? What can we do? And it's like, we need beds. And so it's very interesting. And I worked on the Hill for a year. I see my colleague, Carter Burwell here. We both worked on the Judiciary Committee. And one of the things that Congress could agree on was anti-trafficking. I mean, it's one of the reasons these bills get reauthorized is because nobody in their sane mind is pro-trafficking. And so there is this unique element to human trafficking where everybody can get on board with it. Moving over to my FBI colleague, many of you know or even are more intimately familiar with the details than I am, but Backpage.com. A lot of the cases I worked with Fairfax PD and FBI started as Backpage ads of minors. Backpage has obviously been taken down. But one of the things that I noticed about Backpage was they're incredibly cooperative with law enforcement. I think they knew exactly what they were doing and they wanted to keep law enforcement happy, and so they would give us the types of processes we needed. But with that said, there's no doubt that they were facilitating sex trafficking. First with FBI, then to DSS, how has the game changed in terms of investigating, let's start with juvenile sex trafficking cases rather than adult, now that Backpage is down?
Thank you, and thanks for everyone for being here today and for being involved in this space. As far as Backpage being taken down, you're absolutely correct. Backpage was very cooperative with law enforcement. And so it was somewhat of a double-edged sword when it was taken down because at that point, we knew where most of the trafficking was occurring. However, obviously it had to be taken down. And there was some confusion at first. So it took law enforcement some time to identify where trafficking had moved to. We did see that it had moved back to the street, or the track, so to speak. But ultimately, it has moved back, or has remained on the internet. And it has been somewhat of a challenge of locating where the advertisements had moved to. And then, of course, the advertisements moved from not just web-hosted sites, but also app-based trafficking. So it's still there. The trafficking has moved and has become hosted overseas. So that has been somewhat of a challenge for law enforcement as well, with getting the cooperation from some of those entities. But it has not gone away.
John, with an international perspective and knowing that a lot of these things are being hosted overseas in countries where we may never be able to get the information, how is Backpage, in the taking down of Backpage, impacted what you're doing?
So as the new vehicles sprung up, we start to understand that it would be a space in which we could move, especially if we have our agents and analysts out overseas where my other colleagues from the federal government are not. It gives us the chance to go build teams internationally, not just walk across the street and have a conversation in, say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but to get deep into the host government, meet with them, talk to them, find comparative ways to address the issue, with an ultimate goal to bring it back into a team like you see here for American prosecution. The challenge that we'll have sometimes is initial introductions, people fully understanding the agency that I'm from, who I'm representing, the purposes going forward. But then we're always up against the technological challenge. As every little development produces more and more technology every year, we're in a race to keep up. And so when we knew what Backpage was, we didn't know what the next generation was. We're always anticipating what the bad guys will be doing differently because we're always a day behind them. We get smart. We have great technicians on all of our teams. That awareness, as was earlier mentioned, is not just to the public, but to our own teams who maybe were doing bank robbery before or passport fraud investigations before, to understand this is something that we can also be working on to go after the next big thing that comes down the street.
Zach?
Yeah, go ahead.
Touch on that real quick. The websites, they're still out there, and I know Lenny touched on it with going to apps, and I can think of at least two that I think are more, almost not as prevalent, but almost easier to find: minors and then the adults, people that are looking to do prostitution or trafficking related services. And because they're active investigations, I won't go into details, but find me afterwards. But they're out there, and I think that's why it's important to have summits such as this, and even breaking it down to your MDTs and working and staying in communication with your NGOs. Having that line of communication is important for us as law enforcement because we can't. I'm not a big computer person as far as I know how to find traffickers, I know how to find minors, but I also need help. And so that's why I tell people and all the investigators that we rely on you folks outside law enforcement to help us find out where the Backpage dust, I call it the Backpage dust. All the dust got thrown up in the air. Now we're just going to see where it settles and where it lands.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting, we heard the Attorney General talk yesterday about or maybe it was the day before, about the Pensacola shooting, and one of the things he was talking about was encryption, what we used to call going dark, that they're now calling lawful access. And here you have a terrorist whose phone we can't get into because, for whatever, Apple won't help us. One thing that I was thinking about in preparation for this panel is how is warrant-proof encryption affected your investigations? Because on the one hand, yeah, there probably is use of WhatsApp and other things, but at the same time, they have to interface with the buyers or the pedophiles, the Johns, whatever word you want to use. Lieutenant, how has encryption or the issue of growing dark affected your investigations?
It's massively crippled our ability to pull necessary information in a timely fashion that almost to some will not only provide evidence for prosecution, but will also, probably more importantly, allow us to make more recoveries and make those recoveries more quickly. So it was an atom bomb to our ability to actually conduct thorough, immediate, and effective investigations and pull that information.
Lenny, I know this is something that you all deal with all the time. I always felt like in the cases that I prosecuted, I really wanted the victim to testify. It was important for the jury to see the victim, but you really wanted corroboration because, as we heard from a previous panel, oftentimes they're progressive truth-telling, or you have someone who is under the influence, or there's that trauma bond. How about, from what you all are trying to do, how has the issue of going dark affected your work?
Sure. Same thing as Grant was mentioning. What we're seeing is, and it goes to the corroboration aspect, is when we're trying to corroborate with the victim, saying a lot of that evidence is often on the trafficker's phone. Oftentimes, the trafficker is the one who is communicating with the buyers, posing as the actual victims. And so it's the trafficker's phone that we really would like to get into and oftentimes cannot access if it's a certain type of device. So that's the corroboration aspect and piece, and without that, we then have to rely on the victim, and sometimes the victims are too fearful to cooperate. Sometimes they They have that trauma bonding with the traffickers, and they still feel like they're in love with the traffickers and won't cooperate. And other times it could be so traumatizing to the victims that it's not practical to ask them to do that.
Moving on to what many of you know as the victim-centric approach to investigations. I think all of us at the table, certainly I think DOJ-wide, we subscribe to that method, and it may mean different things to all of us. And I think one of the things that can be difficult in a trafficking investigation is, what is success? Is success when you actually hold that trafficker accountable? You know, if the individual is guilty, he or she is put behind bars and literally incapacitated from trafficking on the street again, hopefully if they don't have access to a cell phone. But, you know, or is it, and this may be in the minds of some of you, I see some great advocates here in the front row who I've worked with, is it that the victim or survivor themselves feels a new sense of empowerment, has some closure, feels safe once again? So let me start with you, John. What does the victim-centric approach mean to you, and is that subscribed to by the Diplomatic Security Service? And how do you judge success in a trafficking case?
It's the starting point for all of our investigations. We might get intake from any number of sources, a telephone call, email. There are a couple of good contacts, friends in the room who know my direct number, and we've built a lot of great cases through simple networking. This might produce a call from some of you later on. Keeping the victim's humanity and independence and safety and security is always forefront in our mindset. It's not just someone we're going to go take some quick notes, bio information, statistics, and move on. To those who are untrained and ill-informed and maybe inexperienced, who come to this task and make that mistake of, you know, just give me your name and phone number, I'll get back to you after I start my typing. That's going to be a horrific fail. So to understand who the person is before you even enter the room. If I know I'm going to be part of an interview, I don't go dressed like this unless we have some reason to think they expect to see someone in a suit. This might present something else to a person from a foreign country, to a person who's been traumatized, maybe by a white male, for me to show up. If I can find someone who might fit a better pattern, that might be in the best interest of the victim. We think about things like that. My introduction to this issue was when I asked what I thought was a simple question. We had gotten through the bio stuff and spent a lot of time, and I said, hey, could you please tell me about what an average day would have been like? And to the victim, I triggered the horror that she had to endure, sometimes twice a day. I didn't know that. And I will never ask that question again without understanding what that might mean. I don't ask questions, I don't start interviews if we've not talked to our Victims Resources Coordinator. We have a staff of 3 covering the entire planet in our program. You heard from Tracy Rags earlier. He has, I think, 36 and 39 interviewers. I'm not embarrassed or afraid to call Tracy, hey, we need to borrow somebody, or can we be part of a team? To ensure that the victim has what they need at that time, if they're able to then convene information, potentially evidence to us. Do they have a contract? Do they have visa records? Something that they can share to help build the case. We'll elicit that from them carefully. I'm not going to reach across the table and grab somebody's passport or say, hey, can you go back and get a contract and we'll do the interview later. It's at the speed that is best for them to further. If it takes a little longer than a standard victim interview of someone who's been involved in an assault or a car accident, we're okay with that.
Detective, one of the things that I found, and again, I'll reference Billy Wolf again, working cases with him, that a lot of times the state and local law enforcement, as well as FBI special agents, that's who I worked with primarily, would develop trust with the victim, and that trust became absolutely paramount. And I don't even know how one starts to develop that with someone who's been lied to repeatedly, oftentimes been sexually assaulted repeatedly. What role, if any, does trust play in your rapport building and investigations?
That's the key thing. It's trust, and having the human, presenting myself as I'm no better than you. Just because I have a badge that says Beaverton Police Department on it makes me no different than you. You're a human. I'm a human, and you have to show that you care. Because what do these these people involved, the victims and survivors in trafficking, what do they pretty much do for a living? They read people. They read their pimp or their trafficker. They need to know how they need to react or what's the home life's going to be. And they're also reading the Johns. They read people. So if I go in, sorry for my language, half-assed to my case, they're going to read that. And do you think that person is going to come and sit down and tell me everything that they have going on in their life, specifically about their pimp or their trafficker? No, there's no way. And they're going to read that, and there's really no point. So I tell people they have to care, and to get the details that you want, expect them to lie. And you can't take it personally, because do you really expect, especially me being a male, to come down and sit in front of a girl or a boy or a transgender or whomever, a 16-year-old that has a trafficker, and expect them right when I sit down and say, my name's Chad, and go through my little spiel, tell me your deepest, darkest secrets of your life. And honestly and realistically, that's not going to happen. It's like here, and I'll use one of the forensic interviewer that I learned from, a dear friend. You know, she says during her training, you know, talk to your neighbor right now. Tell them the last time you're intimate. Give them all your details that happened during that intimacy part. You know, go ahead right now. Talk about it. Are you realistically going to do that to somebody that you don't know? No. And I think developing that trust and showing that you care, they're going to read that fairly easily, and it's not going to open it up, you know, and you're not going to get everything you want off one interview. It's not a one and done thing. It is a constant going back and trying to be involved in their life as much as that they're going to allow.
Lieutenant, how do you measure success in a case?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is a little bit more challenging because, you know, this bumps up against sort of that common shared narrative right now about victim-centered. And, you know, it's very clear that we want to construct to the best of our ability a victim-centered, but not what we would call a victim-built case, right? Where the whole weight of that case is on the shoulders of an individual. That does not, however, prevent us or deny us our obligation toward public safety. And I think one of the most important things that we can do in law enforcement is to continue to sort of measure and address that inherent tension in these, and how do we tease that out? It's not the same for every individual, and every case is going to be different than that. Having real, straightforward, honest conversations about what that means, the what ifs. What if I disclose this? What's the next logical thing? What if I testify? What if I refuse to, you know, provide this information? These are all really important aspects to how we build that trust. But I think with the trust that Chad's talking about, those are much easier to have. So for me, measuring success is a very dynamic and sort of fluid process. I don't think we do it in terms of the maximum number of prosecutions or the maximum number of years. I think that it's more appropriately measured by how many engagements we have with people. And I know that's probably a hard sell to CEOs of law enforcement agencies, but I'm not going to give up trying to convince them yet. So,
Lenny, one of the things that I think is done really well and is critical to many violent crime violations, of which this is one, but specifically so when it comes to human trafficking, is the task force model. And I often think about, you know, the individuals who've got the best understanding of what's happening in a community. Beat police officers, school resource officers, juvenile probation, those folks who really know when something's wrong in a community. What role, if any, does task force play in the Bureau's efforts to combat human trafficking?
So the whole task force concept is critical. The FBI leads 85 child exploitation human trafficking task forces, but we also participate in over a dozen, I think number now is about 17, enhanced collaborative model task forces funded by DOJ. There are also ACT teams that we participate in. The big thing is we as the FBI cannot do it alone. DSS cannot do it alone. State and local officers cannot do it alone. We have to work together. And looking at the table, we are seated alphabetically. It wasn't meant to be federal law enforcement on one side and local officers on another. But we have to work together. And it's not just law enforcement. You have to have a multidisciplinary team. Chad's mentioned it several times. You have to have those service providers in the community, the NGOs in the community, all of the faith-based groups, community groups, working together. There's that common phrase that, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, imagine a child who has been so victimized and traumatized and left behind. So imagine what we have to do to rescue that child and put that child on the pathway to success and survivor. becoming a survivor.
Yeah, I've worked on the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force. Kay Duffield's here, who I used to work with very closely, and I felt like it was that particular group worked really well because we did have a law enforcement component, we had a victim service provider component, and then we had an outreach and awareness component and sort of used that triple-headed monster. That's not to say there weren't times where there was tension. I can remember on a particular case I was working, I really needed a victim to come to grand jury because I needed to lock in her testimony, and I went to the particular service provider where she was behind, basically you entered a code or you hit a button, and the service provider or the advocate said, she's not coming down. I said, well, I've got a grand jury subpoena. They said, well, you're going to have to lock her up. And so you get to that tension. Lieutenant, I don't know if you've ever rubbed up against that, but how do you break through, knowing that you each individually want what's best for the case, for the victim, for the prosecution, fighting the violation as a whole? How do you fight through that, or how do you make that work?
I think the only real way you can make that work is just through communication and sort of challenging your own narrative around that. I mean, we become we answer to our own, ultimately, if you do this work long enough, you start to decide who you really answer to. Do you answer to your own ambitions in this, or do you answer to the needs of the individual that you're out there to save and recover and hopefully set up on a trajectory where they can have a fulfilling and happy and life that's restored and things like that. I think that until we really challenge how we get back to that yardstick measurement, I think we're always going to bump up against these. And it requires people that are willing to have hard conversations.
I agree. One thing that just sort of popped into my head that was not on our outline, but something that I think can be really difficult to handle is when you have an individual who originally was trafficked and then becomes part of the trafficking organization. Where does that line between victim and defendant start and stop, knowing that maybe that individual was a juvenile, and all of a sudden, what the recovered survivors are saying is, no, she was meaner than everyone else. She's the one who tricked me. Just go right down the row. Lenny, I don't know if you've ever encountered that in your career, supervised cases where that's happened, but I found that to be one of the most difficult challenges I faced.
So it is a challenge because that bottom, what you're referring to, did start out as a victim at some point. And perhaps, at least in my experience, became a bottom in order to survive within the framework that the trafficker had created. So it's challenging. It's you as law enforcement and working with your prosecutor can't necessarily just treat that individual as purely a trafficker or purely a victim. So it's a challenge. You have to do sometimes what is going to be best for the overall case that you're building. And sometimes those individuals don't have to face the same level of punishment that maybe they deserve, but they also need assistance as well. John?
For us, I think I would simply tell the members of our team, we're here to find facts and to find the facts as the best way we can. Sometimes with passion, sometimes without any connection, to be cold and austere talking to someone. I've had a couple of occasions to talk to traffickers, and I've not been disrespectful, I've not been upset with them. I've tried to get them to answer some of my questions, and I actually got someone to say, yeah, why would we pay him? And I feverishly wrote down that note to then come back and show my team. So if we're doing our jobs and finding the facts to bring it back and talk to the prosecutors to help map out the road forward, there might be discussions, and it's like you know better than us about how we might package that person maybe to present to the jury if it comes to that.
Yeah, before I throw it over to the locals, I mean, one of the things that obviously Congress has given us tremendous power with 1591, 18 U.S.C. 1591, 10-year mandatory minimums, one victim, one time. We charge that. Juries has tremendous amount of jury appeal. Judges, it's not one of those mandatory minimums you ever hear people talking about we need to reduce. Well, if you have someone who originally started as a victim who's now engaged in the enterprise, is that someone who should spend 10 years in prison? Well, that may be one of those times where we look at what we refer to as the Sessions charging memo and say, okay, it might be a miscarriage of justice if we charge it in that manner. Obviously, it's fact specific, so let's charge a conspiracy with no mandatory minimum. So that's some of the ways we've handled it. Detective?
I don't charge my victims as far as any trafficking or prostitution-related offenses. Now, if we're talking about, like Lenny was talking about, the bottoms, that creates a unique dynamic within that case, and every case is going to be different. Have I charged my bottom before? Yes, with the mandatory minimum charges, but like it was talked about, that we'll plead it down or dismiss. Does that solve the problem for that person? No, but there's that fine line that initially can't be crossed. But you also have to realize as the investigator that, and it's been talked about, that bottom or that girl, the girlfriend of the pimp, she was victimized at some point as well, whether as a minor or even when she was an adult. I think what's crucial to have an NGO or an advocacy group that is tied in within your cases, and we have one in Beaverton called Safety Compass, and they are phenomenal, and they will see victims up until the age of 24 or provide services. So even if you have somebody that is 21, 22, and even if they're involved in the trafficking of someone else, they can still initially be charged, but I can also start to get them advocate-related services through our NGO and to get them any possible help that they need and to get them set up for when that case is done, then they can hopefully make the choices to succeed.
Lieutenant?
You know, and I think that to add sort of a wrinkle to this discussion, I mean, we're not just talking about the trauma that goes along with being sexually exploited. I've had multiple cases of against traffickers who survived horrendous childhood trauma that was not necessarily sexually related, but that absolutely shaped them into the person that they became. I'm not trying to give traffickers or anybody a pass, but what I'm trying to say is that our understanding of justice has to incorporate in some way, shape, or form past history of trauma. So.
Without question. Lieutenant, staying with you for a second, I see Barbara Maya in the front row, and she's been someone who's inspired me for a long time in this work, and she came and spoke at a class I used to teach. And in that class, one of the things we would talk about are the different types of human trafficking, even the different types of sex trafficking, whether it starts as survival sex when, you know, a victim is couch surfing in order to meet their needs. And then it turns into a gang-controlled or a guerrilla pimp model versus a Romeo pimp. One of the areas that you've really looked into, I believe, is homelessness. And that we have not had the massive tent cities here in the DMV area the way at least I see them portrayed in California and elsewhere. Talk to us about homelessness and trafficking.
Well, my first introduction into trafficking among what we would call ultra vulnerable populations, among which the homeless, but also people that are struggling with sort of mental illness or substance abuse issues or things like that, came several years ago, and it wasn't until I really started working full-time among the homeless. I mean, we have encampments where 100% of the women in those encampments have been trafficked, and that's just a shocking, and we're not talking small encampments of 3 tents, we're talking mass encampments. What's really alarming about it is that when you measure that trauma of what it has meant to be sexually exploited against all the other trauma in their lives, it doesn't have the same impact as it does with many of our other survivors. They don't measure it the same way because they've sort of come to accept that as just a natural sort of part of them being homeless or them being out there and being vulnerable. So it's one of those places, I think, when we talk about real vulnerable populations, that we're just learning to open our eyes more. We've really tended to typify the normal average victim or survivor, and we really should be sort of opening our lens to see more of the populations that are being affected that we're missing.
Well, I hope that's something that gets more attention. One of the things that I read with great interest every year is the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report put out by the State Department. And what I think is interesting is the TIP report will give you broad brushes, but also focus in on things like Ghanaian fishing villages and issues in mining and things like that. John, what are we seeing, before we fixate or go back to sort of a domestic question, globally, what is DSS seeing worldwide? I mean, I know there's massive labor trafficking that happens in some of the Arab countries when there's a caste system involved. What kind of trends can you share with us?
I think starting at the very top, the very worst situation, if there's a region, and bear with me, I won't be naming any nation specifically. I'm not cleared for that level of information to share. But if there's a war someplace, people are fleeing that war zone. And they're just trying to get away from the impact of bombs and craters. And people will exploit as somebody walks by, like, look at that person. They don't have much except what's on their back. I'm going to go see if I can get something out of them. So when you're talking tens of thousands of people, it's just going to be exponentially huge as they're affected by smuggling with the small instances of trafficking built within. We don't have a massive radar system to say, wow, look at all those people fleeing that war zone or that natural disaster or some massive economic strife to say there's a trafficking victim, there's a trafficking victim. We're reliant upon partners. And I'm sorry to be a broken record and keep going back to partners and teams, but that's how we see the individuals who are trafficked in these other horrific episodes, whether it's war or natural disaster. And it could be anywhere in the world. I don't think I'm worried about Australians being trafficked today because of the fires, but you really only need to watch a little bit of news once, every couple of days to realize there's bad places in the world and people are leaving them. We remain this bright beacon on the hill, and people want to come here because of the protections, because of freedom first as a concept, because this is where you can earn money for doing a solid day's work. We would prefer it to be legal work. But the trends are just global. You really can look in any region of the world and find episodes. And maybe it doesn't reach all the way to the United States, the trafficking, but we are certainly connected to it through our work outside in American embassies, and specifically to the work that we can do interacting with foreign law enforcement.
Well, I think it's something that IJM hits on all the time, which is where you have the breakdown of rule of law. This is what happens, so I couldn't agree with you more. Before we move on, do you have a comment, Lieutenant? No, okay. Well, let's moving back domestically for a second. Let's see if we can, in our remaining 15 minutes, we can hopefully have some positive news. As we move forward, what is it, and Lenny, let me start with you in the Bureau. What is it that we can do better as we fight this next generation of traffickers? Where are we going?
So I think the big thing is we need to continue with our victim-centered approach. I'm going to touch on one of your earlier questions about how do we define success. And I don't think there's one good answer, but I can tell you what it's not, at least in my opinion. It's not the number of arrests. It's not any kind of statistic-based accomplishment like we would look at other criminal activity. I think it's case by case. And the way I've seen it with cases that I've worked, cases that I've supervised and been involved with, is you walk away from each case and you make that decision. Is, did we do enough for this individual or these groups of individuals? Have we gotten them in a better place? And I think that's how we have to look at success. Instead of the quantitative factor, we have to look at it from a qualitative standpoint.
I think that's a really important point, because one of the things in this day and age where everyone wants to measure data and metrics, and that's a real benefit. Frankly, I think it makes our government more accountable and makes us more efficient. These cases, at least in my experience, are so time intensive. You can spend hours and months just building trust with one victim to hopefully bring a case where you can rip, if you've got a Title III wire intercept on a drug case, you can take down 20 people, get your stat, and move on. And you really do need supervisors and leaders who are willing to give you the amount of time to build these cases correctly. John, what do you think? Where are we headed, for the next 5 years? What can we do better, and where are we headed?
Well, I hope it's easier than the past 5 years. I'm going to assume for all of us, we never went through any kind of human trafficking training when we started our careers. It didn't exist. I'm happy to report our partners from Homeland Security are conducting human trafficking awareness training. I think the very first class is tomorrow. I didn't get to go through that when I started 20 years ago. We've tried through a couple fits and starts to get training on our own. That's not effective. We have to do it together as a team. That I'm hoping the next generation, as they come to offices like mine, will be ready for it. Not every office is going to have it. Once we build those teams, do our colleagues in maybe competing offices. So if I went to maybe a cyber crimes team, they might try to pick out some of our best agents and analysts, especially if we've got analysts who are learning so much on the technical side to fight trafficking. If maybe there's a promotion or a assignments cap, they might jump ship and go work for some other team fighting some other crime. That's always in the back of my mind. How soon am I going to have to try and rebuild a team? Sustainment is something I'm trying to drive home with people who will listen to me in my organization. How will we keep the team together? I don't know that I have any magical solutions, but at least we're talking about it. We didn't talk about stuff like this 10 years ago. We were just trying to jump into the arena, do the good work that I think we've done, but now to work on improvements and moving further.
Detective, just a little wrinkle on that. If you could include in your answer, one of the things that the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, now makes explicit, and it's something we've started to do in the Eastern District, which we didn't do a lot of before, is prosecute buyers and try to reduce the demand side. As far as from your perspective, where are we going? What can we do better? What role, if any, in your answer does prosecuting demand and buyers play?
Well, truthfully, where I'm at, the going after the buyers, I am, as far as my agency, the primary investigator, and this is using that as an example. If you're not a larger agency, you have to prioritize. Not saying that the buyers are, or the adult victims or survivors aren't high on the list, but you have to prioritize the minors, and this is for me, traffickers, and then go after the buyers. And I wish it was different. I think if you have enough people, hitting the buyers is something that is a necessity that needs to happen. But also, I'm going to be realistic. If you don't have a large group, or if you don't have a large task force, that is something that you have to, unfortunately, you have to make decisions on what's the best to do. It may not have answered your question very well because I'm in a spot where we can't be super aggressive and proactive with the buyers. I'm doing everything I can as far as keep my head above water, rescuing minors, and identifying the traffickers on that end.
I'd like to interject, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say quite the opposite. I think your answer is incredibly refreshing and realistic. We're not up here to just, talk about sunshines and rainbows. Like, that's the reality. And for a lot of people, that's what they're faced with. They don't have the resources, so you have to go after the worst of the worst, which are the traffickers and the recruiters. We have the luxury, especially on the Fed side, we carry about, a third of the caseload of our state and local counterparts and DA's offices, CA's offices, et cetera. And so we have that luxury, but I think you're exactly right. And frankly, as we first started working this violation, 8 or 9 years ago in earnest, we weren't going after the buyers. So no, I appreciate your candor. Lieutenant?
Yeah, and I totally am empathetic with Chad's position, and it's shared by a lot of people. I think that for us, we started Guardian Angel in 2014, actually on Valentine's Day of 2014. And over the next 4 years that we ran it until right after the Super Bowl, we arrested about 1,700 men in 8 different states, all on felonies, and we had an over 90% conviction rate for those. The majority of them never saw the inside of a courtroom. The majority, well, they pled out. There wasn't a jury or anything. But I see buyers as not necessarily the key, but one of the keys, one of them, to how we really combat this long term. And the data that we collected over that period of time suggests it's a relatively small number of people that are just repeating buying. And so I do think that there's a real opportunity. And consequently, when you talk about training, like John brought up, that was our primary mechanism, Guardian Angel was, to bring in agencies that wanted to do something but didn't know where to begin. You build immediate collaboration, you demonstrate for them a model that they can effectively deploy with relative ease, and then you also provide the agency CEOs and the leaders something that they can actually use as a model of, yep, we're engaging and we're doing something in the community. So I'm all about doing that for the buyers, just so you know. I think it's important.
Lenny, John, any comments on that and reducing the demand side?
I think one opportunity that we have in federal law enforcement, and I would like to see more of, and it would be prosecuting, the ability to prosecute the buyers as traffickers. Yep. Because by definition of the statute, we can. I think maybe that's something we could evolve and start doing, but it goes back to, I think, something Chad said. It goes to resources. So prioritizing which cases, and then, you know, our recovery of victims as well. So I think it's definitely a possibility, but it's challenging at the same time.
Sure. Go ahead, John.
To the grander issue of all trafficking, we need the public's help. We need the public to understand. We can't just chase the Johns. What a terrible first name to have in the anti-trafficking world. To identify what the problem is. So, you know, if you find out that my cup of coffee this morning was produced at the hands of people in a coffee plantation through trafficking, maybe I shouldn't buy coffee from that coffee stand anymore. Or am I just going to be lazy and like, I really like that coffee? Can we better inform the American public as to what it is they're purchasing? We rely upon so many others, but really upon the American public to do that.
In our remaining 5 minutes, I want to do something a little unorthodox. A bunch of my colleagues are here, U.S. attorneys from around the country, and I want to give them the opportunity to just stand up and introduce themselves and say what office they're from, because this is a whole of government approach, and I just think it speaks volumes. I drove across the river, frankly, and many of them took flight. So, Billy, if we can start with you. Just. Thanks, Billy. Nick. Thanks, Nick. John?
Thanks. I'm John Lawson, U.S. Attorney in Northern Illinois, which is Chicago. I actually was in the USA for 11 years before coming back as U.S. Attorney, and the single biggest difference I noticed about what my office did was much more in this case. And the people that are colleagues from the most important people in the office, the hardest working, and do a fantastic job. I'm a victim witness specialist that we have in our office. They do outstanding work, as I'm sitting here listening to all of you today. I'm thinking about all the key thank you notes and each sentence of them because of all their great work. Thank you all. It's a fantastic panel. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, John. Jeff?
I'm Jeff Jensen. I'm the U.S. Attorney in Houston, Missouri, St. Louis. Actually, that guy was very good. I started out doing child porn cases when they were on bulletin board services. That's how they thank you so much, panel. Thank you especially Barbara, Susan, that's just really something I'll never forget. Barbara,
Thanks. Eric has been a huge inspiration to a lot of us in this space. Peter?
Good afternoon. I'm Dean Deegan, U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Iowa. So we have a lot of trucking, we got a lot of agricultural issues, and we have massage parlors, just like all over. And I've been a prosecutor since 1998, and I worked these cases, other types of child sex exploitation cases. I think we do a very good job in my district of getting the word out and educating folks. I've got a sheet of paper here with all sorts of wonderful ideas I picked up today to go back to my district and try to actually do more on the enforcement. Thanks very much, everyone, for doing this today.
Peter? Mike?
Good afternoon, Mike Hurst, United States Attorney of Mississippi, save the best for last. We just launched a statewide, human trafficking council in the state of Mississippi with my colleague in the North District, Chad Lamar. And in my district, we recently launched 5 investigative task forces, small, rural, regional task forces to try to combat this, especially in our rural areas.
Thank you. Lewis?
Louis Franklin, U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Alabama. I've been with the office for a long time before becoming U.S. Attorney. I was an Assistant United States Attorney for 26 years. And unlike most of my colleagues, this is something new that my office is getting into. We actually tried our first human trafficking case a couple of years ago, and it was the first introduction for me to see the problems with trying to get the victims on board with what we're trying to do, also educate our judges on how important this issue is. So it's been a priority and will continue to be one in my office.
Did I miss anybody? Anybody else hiding out there? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. It just speaks volumes that you be here in support of this. We've got just a minute or two left. I want to give the last word to the panelists here, but I also want to thank Stacy. One of the things that I'm really proud of is when I was working on the Hill and we weren't getting anything done, we created an Elder Justice Coordinator position in the Office of Deputy Attorney General. The reason we did that is because some of you out there had the good sense to create a Human Trafficking Coordinator position in the Office of Deputy Attorney General, and that's Stacy. And so the fact, I just can't emphasize enough, having someone in the nucleus of the Justice Department, in case it's news to anyone, the Deputy Attorney General is the day-to-day COO of the department. And to have someone who sits at that table and sits on that floor and sits in that wing every day, day in, day out, to focus on this violation, frankly, does more to move the needle than a lot of other things. So a huge thanks to you, Stacy. Gentlemen, yeah, let's give her a round of applause. Thank you for whoever started clapping. I appreciate that. Usually my wife would kick me. Guys, last comments before we finish up. Lenny?
Yeah, and it's been repeated throughout the day, whether you call it partnership or collaboration, bottom line, it's working together, and it involves everyone in this room. It doesn't matter if you're a law enforcement officer, if you're a prosecutor, if you're a victim specialist, if you're a service provider, an NGO, it doesn't matter. We can only effectively combat human trafficking by working together.
To be able to help spread the good word through my agency, both domestically and internationally, is just exceedingly rewarding. Very honored to be part of this group here today. To watch a case initiate, go all the way to conclusion, to see a conviction, to watch somebody go to prison for what they did to another human being or human beings is very rewarding, but it does not even begin to compare to being able to connect to a survivor and know that they've crossed that realm from being a victim to survivor and know that they're on a completely different path is very hard to explain to people who aren't in this room right now and don't know what we're talking about. So spread the good word. Let's go find some more and build more cases.
3 things real quick. Investigators, remain proactive on the investigations. If you're waiting for these cases to land up on your desk or in your mailbox at work, we're missing a ton. If you got to remain proactive and search the ads, search the apps to find especially the minors that are being trafficked. 2, there are no bad victims. I don't want to hear any investigators and or prosecutors say, well, we're not going to prosecute that case because they're a bad victim. There are no bad victims. I can go and I can get on the stand anytime and I can explain to a jury, and that's how confident I am. That's probably a downfall of myself. but I can explain any way, in any time, why that, usually the girl or boy or whomever, why they're acting in a way or why they're engaged in that activity, because we need to explain why it makes sense, and usually it does to a jury. And then lastly, you can prove a trafficking case without mentioning that term prostitute. So easy to do. You don't need to, they are not prostitutes. You don't even have to put it in your police report. Any type of labeling of prostitute, you just have to show certain elements of the crime, and it starts early, and we teach that so it doesn't, I don't want that label ever to go to somebody saying I'm just a prostitute regardless of their age.
I think that we are so much further ahead than when I first started doing this work that I just have a real heart of gratitude for everybody that's here and just everybody that's impassioned about this and it works hard on this issue. I think that the road ahead is going to be a tough one because we're going to have to unlearn some things that we've learned and release some things that we've held as truth. And I think one of those for law enforcement is that we start to take more of a public safety approach, and that would be a more holistic, inclusive, generalized way that we look at this issue. And it's not, we're not going to solve this with handcuffs. If we were going to, we would have by now. I think that we have to start looking at relying more on our partnerships, as has been said. We have to start looking at the recovery and restoration of individuals on both sides of this, in the victim category and the offender category, and we have to do it collectively.
Would you please join me in thanking both our panel and the Office of Justice Program?